The blizzard swept the mountains like a furious wrath descending from a slate-gray sky. Wind howled through the treetops, dragging flurries of snow that smothered every trace of life. The cold was so intense that each breath instantly turned to mist and froze mid-air. Familiar trails around the rescue station were now vague outlines beneath layers of ice, and it was impossible to tell where the path ended and the cliff began. The entire landscape stood silent and frozen, as though time itself had come to a halt beneath the falling snow. In the heart of that desolate scene, Max, a seasoned German Shepherd rescue dog, pressed forward on sturdy legs, his thick gray-brown coat trembling in the biting wind. Max was no ordinary dog. Years of military service had taken him through brutal rescue missions, mudslides, floods, war zones where explosions blended with cries for help. After retiring from the army, Max was reassigned to the mountain rescue team, where someone like Rachel could truly understand and walk beside a soul that had survived the brink of death more than once. Rachel, strong and steady, her dark brown hair tucked under a thick hood, walked closely behind Max. Her steps were slow but deliberate. She never underestimated weather like this. Years of rescue work had taught her that when nature turned cruel, everything, every branch, every step, could become a trap. But today, her unease didn't stem from the storm. It was Max. Since morning, he had acted strangely, standing still at the doorway, staring into the forest, growling low in his throat, circling as if trying to say something. And now, in this whiteout of silence, Max suddenly froze. Rachel stopped behind him. She saw his body tense, the fur along his spine bristling, ears perked, eyes locked on something unseen deep in the snow-covered forest. The wind screamed louder, snow stung her face, but Max didn't budge, as if gripped by an invisible signal pulsing from beneath the frozen earth. A low growl rumbled from his throat, deep, urgent, and unmistakably focused. Rachel knew immediately. Max had sensed something, not danger. Life. She stepped toward him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "What is it, Max?" she whispered into the storm. Max turned to her, his intelligent eyes burning with urgency. It was the same look she'd seen 5 years ago, the night she was buried under an avalanche. Everyone else had given up. Only Max kept digging. It was those eyes, those paws, that had brought her back to life. And now, that same look was guiding her to another soul, whoever it might be, whatever awaited them in the white silence ahead. Without hesitation, Rachel tightened the leash and signaled, "Lead the way, old friend." Max didn't pause. He charged forward, tearing through the thick snow, leaving behind the safety of the patrol path. Rachel followed close, eyes squinting through the storm, heart pounding in her chest. Something was waiting out there. A fragile life, a quiet miracle, and only Max could find it in this endless white. As if driven by some invisible force, Max surged ahead, leaving a trail of deep paw prints in the snow that now buried every known path. Rachel kept close, her boots slipping slightly on the frozen ground, but she didn't question it, not even for a second. Max had never led her wrong. Through countless missions and close calls, his instincts had always been spot on, like a compass in the chaos. In this frozen wilderness, where everything seemed lifeless, only Max could still sense what humans could not. The wind howled like breaking branches and snow stung her face like needles, but Max didn't flinch. He veered north, toward a dense part of the forest where the trees grew close, and the ground was dark, damp, and rarely traveled. This was far off their usual patrol route. Rachel hadn't stepped foot here since last fall. She frowned slightly, glancing at the ghostly branches reaching like skeletal fingers from the snow. Still, Max showed no hesitation. He pulled the leash taut, body leaning forward, back legs kicking as if urging her to move faster. Then he stopped. At the base of a towering oak, its bark glazed with frost, Max let out a low growl. His eyes darkened, locked on the frozen ground. Without waiting for a command, he began to dig. each movement swift and determined, sending sprays of snow into the air. Rachel dropped to her knees beside him, using her hands to scrape at the icy cover, as if uncovering a secret buried under a heavy white blanket. Within moments, Max whimpered, a deep, desperate sound, half cry, half plea. That's when Rachel saw it. A piece of thin, wrinkled fabric frozen into the ice. Her fingers trembled as she followed the cloth and touched the skin. Frozen. Fragile. A tiny body, nearly camouflaged against the snow, blue as if time had forgotten it. A baby. A newborn. Just days old. Loosely wrapped in a tattered, frozen cloth and left motionless at the foot of the tree like discarded firewood. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She lifted the baby. So light she could feel the faintest tremble of life, or perhaps the memory of it. The infant's cheeks were stiff with cold, tiny arms curled inward as if bracing against death's grip. Max moved closer, gently licking the baby's face, a simple, instinctive gesture, yet full of quiet tenderness. And then, like a snowflake melting in silence, a broken, shallow breath escaped the child's chest. Rachel clutched the baby to her, her heart leaping at that faint pulse. It was still there, still holding on. She tore off her jacket, wrapped the baby tightly, and held it close, her voice breaking with fear and hope. "Hold on, sweetheart. You're not alone anymore." Max stood beside them, eyes fixed on the baby, ears alert, his whole body tense as if guarding something sacred. Not far away, hidden in the misty trees, a man sat inside a black SUV, watching. He wore a worn military jacket, half his body swallowed by the shadows. His eyes narrowed as he looked toward the forest where Max had started digging. His face was blank, emotionless, as though abandoning a baby in a snowstorm was nothing at all. He lit a cigarette, exhaled a plume of smoke, and glanced at the blood-stained cloth beside him, the last trace of his cruelty. When he saw Rachel lift the baby from the ground, he smirked, unconcerned. In a storm like this, he believed, no one could save the child in time. But he was wrong. He hadn't counted on Max, the dog with the instincts of a soldier, the heart of a mother, and a loyalty that defied the cold. And on this day, it was Max who made evil tremble for the first time. In the heavy silence blanketing the snow-covered forest, the only sounds were Rachel's ragged breath, the wind howling through bare branches, and Max, the loyal dog, sitting close by, his eyes fixed on the freezing newborn cradled in her arms. The tiny body was curled tight, skin tinged purple-blue, lips nearly colorless, cheeks frozen stiff, and miniature fists clenched as if holding on to the last thread of existence. Rachel wrapped the baby tightly in her thick coat, pressing it against her chest, her bare hand slipping free from its glove to touch the child's back, pouring her warmth into the fragile frame, as if willing to give up her own life just to coax one more breath from the child. Max whimpered softly. Not loud, not sharp, but full of a quiet anguish that caught in the throat. He stepped closer, slowly, as if afraid even his breath might hurt the baby, then gently lowered his nose to touch its frost-bitten cheek, a gesture filled with tenderness, like a soft kiss from life offered to death. His tongue brushed across the icy skin, melting the frost with careful licks. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, a miracle happened. The baby's eyelids twitched. A faint, broken hiccup escaped its lips, barely audible, barely there, but more real than anything Rachel had ever heard. Her heart clenched. The baby was alive. A tear slipped from her eye, landing warm on the child's forehead, melting instantly into the cold. Rachel could hardly believe what her hands felt. A heartbeat, faint but steady. She looked to Max, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange that needed no words. "You found it. You saved a life." Max didn't bark, didn't wag his tail. He simply stayed there, still and watchful, like a soldier who had just fulfilled the most sacred mission of his life. Rachel began to shake, not just from the cold, but from the storm of emotion inside her. She had never stood so close to the razor's edge between life and death, where hope was as thin as frost on a baby's lashes. She pulled a thermal rescue blanket from her coat pocket, wrapped it around the child, and then turned to Max with a look that said everything. "We need to get to the hospital now." Max rose instantly, his body taut with urgency, ready for whatever came next. Not far away, deep in the forest where trees blocked every trace of light, the black SUV still sat motionless in a clearing. Behind the wheel, a man lounged with unnerving calm. No panic, no rush. He flicked ash into a paper cup on the dash, eyes locked on a phone screen streaming footage from a hidden dash cam near the old gas station. On it, frame by frame, was Elena, the young woman with wild hair and a face twisted in terror, as she fled from the cabin where he'd kept her, carrying the baby, the cargo he'd been paid handsomely to deliver this week. He'd thought it was flawless. Elena was weak, scared, and wouldn't get far in the snow. He'd caught up, taken the baby, and left it buried under layers of snow, where no one, not even wild animals, would find it. What he hadn't accounted for was a dog. Max, a name he'd never heard, was now unraveling everything. From the moment that child was found, the man's certainty began to crack. His hands tightened around the steering wheel, his mind racing. If the baby lived, Elena might talk. And if she told the truth, the whole machine behind him, the underground operation known only as the Network, where he was a key link, could collapse in a heartbeat. All he knew now was this: the baby was still alive, and to protect the Network's secret, he would have to act again. Meanwhile, in the frozen mountain forest, Rachel held the child tight, her face focused and fierce as she moved quickly toward the truck parked a few hundred meters away. Max ran close beside her, glancing back now and then, as if to check they weren't being followed. Snow fell harder. The wind howled louder. But nothing. Not the cold, not the storm, not the threat waiting beyond the trees, could stop these two souls. A woman who refused to surrender to fate, and a dog who had chosen to be a hero. A miracle had happened once, and they would not let it slip away. The heavy-duty truck groaned as it struggled to start under the thick snowfall, the engine shrieking like it was fighting off the ice, gnawing at every fuel line, every frozen gear. Rachel gripped the steering wheel tightly, her hands numb. Bare, after stripping off her gloves to press the infant against the warmth of her chest. She could feel the child's frozen skin trembling against her, like a small leaf quivering in the heart of a brutal snowstorm. The baby's heartbeat was slow, achingly slow, but still there. A fragile rhythm, hanging by a thread, yet enough for Rachel to pour every last ounce of strength into keeping it alive, even if all she had left was a sliver of hope. Max sat in the passenger seat, anything but relaxed. He hadn't blinked once since getting into the truck. His golden brown eyes never left the infant cradled in Rachel's arms. One large paw rested lightly on the dashboard, part for balance, part as if guarding the child himself. There was no music, no radio, only the steady growl of the engine battling the storm and the pounding of Rachel's heart in her chest. Every breath she took was icy with despair, but layered beneath that was a silent vow that she would not let another life slip away in her arms. Not again. On the winding mountain road that led to town, visibility was near zero. Snow came down like a curtain, and heavy chunks slid from the tree branches above, slamming against the windshield. Rachel had to lean forward to make out the path, barely visible beneath the slick sheen of ice. Though her body trembled, she didn't loosen her grip on the wheel, nor on the infant pressed close beneath layers of her coat and a foil-lined thermal blanket. Then, halfway up a steep incline, the rear wheels suddenly lost traction, skidding sideways, sending the truck lurching. The engine growled, then went silent, snuffed out like a candle in the snow. In that instant, everything froze. Rachel twisted the key in the ignition. The truck sputtered weakly, then died. She tried again, heart thudding. Nothing. Her stomach sank. If she couldn't get the child to the hospital in time, there was no telling how little hope remained. Then Max, who had sat tensely silent, barked, loud and sharp. It wasn't panic. It was a command, urgency, a cry that said, "Don't stop, you can't stop now, Rachel." He stood with both front paws braced on the dash, leaning toward her, eyes fierce, not pleading, but pushing, like a leader demanding she rise again. Rachel met his gaze, the same one that had pulled her from the avalanche 5 years ago, the one that saw her through so many sleepless nights. And this time, it was here again when she needed it most. Without hesitation, she twisted the key once more, leaning her whole body forward like she could will the truck back to life. And the engine roared back with a shuddering growl, breaking through the frozen silence. She slammed the accelerator. The truck jolted, tires spinning before catching traction on solid ground. It surged forward as if it too understood what was at stake inside its cabin. Rachel exhaled sharply. She didn't know if it was relief or the ache of emotion too big to hold in. Max settled back into his seat, but his eyes never left the baby. Every breath, every faint whimper, it was as if Max could feel it in his chest. He wasn't just a dog. He was a silent guardian, patient and unwavering. As they sped through slick turns and thick snowdrifts elsewhere on the edge of town, a black SUV sat idle outside a crumbling building, once a relay station for the shadowy group called The Network. Inside, the cold-eyed man stared at photo after photo on his phone. Images beamed in from hidden dash cams. Rachel holding the baby. Max was at her side. The rescue truck pushed through the snow. His lips tightened. His eyes narrowed. "The baby can't make it to the hospital," he muttered. Then he tapped a number and waited. When the voice on the other end answered, he said coldly, "Activate Plan D. Stop them before they reach the center." The voice replied flatly, "Understood." And so it began. In the space between two worlds, one ruled by hidden cruelty, the other by wordless love and devotion, Max remained still, a silent flame burning in the heart of winter, guarding this fragile life, steadying Rachel's spirit. Because he knew, not everyone gets the chance to become a miracle. But this time, Max had been chosen, and he would not let that chance go to waste. The wail of Rachel's rescue siren cut through the frozen silence of the small mountain town like a blade. As her truck screeched to a halt at the emergency bay, the back door swung open and Rachel leapt out, the baby still wrapped tightly inside her coat. Her whole body trembled, partly from cold, partly from exhaustion, and partly from the fear that the precious seconds she'd fought so hard to save were slipping through her fingers like sand. Max, drenched in snow, jumped out behind her, as close as a shadow. His eyes blazed through the whiteout, not with fear, but with a will ignited by something deeper than instinct. The ER doors slid open on their sensors, and a team of doctors and nurses rushed out with a stretcher and medical gear, shouting over the dry, antiseptic air. Rachel handed over the baby, lips trembling as she gasped, over and over. Found in the snow, newborn hypothermia, still breathing. The moment her hands let go, her knees buckled. It was as if her life force had been suspended with each fragile beat of that tiny heart. Max didn't bark, didn't whine. He simply walked to the doors of the neonatal ICU, the room where the baby was now fighting to live, and stood there, head lowered, ears pricked, eyes locked on the foggy glass, as though he could hear something beyond it. The pulse monitor, urgent whispers of nurses, or maybe the faint breath of the child he had pulled back from death. A middle-aged doctor slowed as he passed Max, frowning. He'd never seen a dog behave like this, but when he looked into Max's eyes, those calm, focused, watchful eyes, he turned to the nurse beside him and said softly, "Don't stop him. Let him stay." Rachel sat on a bench in the hallway. A thin blanket draped over her shoulders, doing little to warm the cold sunk deep into her bones. She kept her gaze fixed on Max, and on the ICU door that separated them from the life they had fought for. Every minute passed like a lifetime. Her mind replayed the baby's last faint cry in her arms, over and over. Was she still breathing? Was that miracle strong enough to grow beyond the fragile line between life and death? Max didn't move. A young nurse stepped out of the ICU, clipboard in hand, then froze when she saw the dog still lying close to the ground, eyes unblinking. She hesitated, then walked to Rachel, crouching beside her. "We're warming her body with rapid heat therapy, monitoring the heart, administering glucose. She's still so weak, but her heart, it's still fighting. Something is keeping her here." Her voice softened as her eyes flicked toward Max. Maybe it's him. Across the city, hidden behind the forest, a faint red glow flickered from a fireplace in a dilapidated cabin. There, the man sat, face cold and unreadable, eyes fixed on the satellite phone in his hand. On its screen, a GPS tracker displayed the path of the SUV he had abandoned near the woods, the last place Rachel had stopped. He zoomed in, his gaze narrowing at the hospital's location on the map. A smirk tugged at his lips. "So you're still alive," he muttered, as if speaking to the child he'd discarded, a defective piece of cargo that now posed a dangerous risk. He dialed a number. On the other end, a woman answered, her voice smooth, sharp, like metal sliding across glass. "Your order?" He replied without emotion. "Eliminate it, before it's too late." Then he ended the call, stood up, and stared at the only photo on the cabin wall. Rows of infants swaddled in white, lined up like products on a shelf. "She won't ruin what I've built," he murmured. "No one will, not even her, not even that dog." Back at the hospital, night had fallen. Snow still drifted down, layering the ICU windows in white. The amber glow of streetlights softened the hallway, but couldn't dispel the tension. Max hadn't left his post. Not for food, not for water. Rachel sat beside him, slumped against the wall, her forehead resting gently on his head. Neither moved. They were two sentinels standing guard over a soul still locked in its quiet war. And then, at 9:14 p.m., the monitor beeped. Steady, strong. The baby's heart was growing stronger. Color returned to her skin. Her breathing evened out. A nurse let out a choked laugh, tears welling in her eyes. She made it through the critical stage. The head doctor nodded, stepped out into the hallway, and saw Rachel and Max still waiting. He smiled. "She pulled through," he said quietly. "And I believe it's thanks to you both." Rachel broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around Max, pressing her forehead to his. Max let out a soft, low whine, gentle as an exhale, as if finally releasing all the weight he had carried, and turned his head toward the glowing ICU door. He knew the baby had made it, but he also knew this was only the beginning, and he would stay, because his mission wasn't over. Not yet. Not while the dark still stirred on the other side of the world. As the door to the ICU closed quietly behind the doctor, and the rhythmic beeping of machines inside began to steady, like a fragile lullaby signaling life's return, Rachel sat back against the wall, her eyes rimmed red with emotion. Her hand still rested on Max's head, as if grounding herself in the quiet, unshakable presence of the dog who had walked beside her through more than just tonight's storm, through battles no one else had ever seen. In that stillness, as the hallway emptied and footsteps faded, a memory stirred, one Rachel had never forgotten, a memory buried deep beneath the snow where her life had once hung by a thread. It was 5 winters ago, along the northern border, during a high-risk military operation. Back then, Rachel was a field medic with the Army's Rescue Division, and Max was the newly transferred K-9 from a special training unit. Massive, guarded, expressionless, and wary of humans. They hadn't started with trust. Max obeyed only his handler, and to Rachel, he was just another tool to dig through rubble in the cold. Then one day, deep in the frozen mountains, an avalanche hit without warning. Burying the team under tons of ice and snow, Rachel disappeared without a trace. All the unit recovered were her shattered radio and a crushed field cap, half buried beneath nearly 2 meters of snow. After 18 fruitless hours, the team was ready to declare her KIA. But Max refused. He sniffed, pawed, barked, then began to dig obsessively in one spot, an area no one believed held any chance of survival. The commander called him off, but Max kept going, digging through ice until his paws bled, the sharp crust cutting into his skin. And then, just as everyone was ready to turn away, a faint tapping echoed from beneath the snow. Rachel, her leg broken, body frozen and nearly unconscious, was knocking the butt of her rifle weakly against the wall of her icy tomb. Max was the reason they pulled her out of that grave. She was unconscious, lips blue, when they laid her on the stretcher. But even then, she clutched tightly the thin scarf Max had worn around his neck, marked with his unit. From that moment on, they were no longer teammates. They were survivors, bound by something deeper than orders. After returning from deployment, Rachel bore wounds no scan could show. PTSD crept in like cold through cracks. She dreamt of avalanches, woke drenched in sweat, and felt alien in her world. She retreated into a small cabin in the mountains, far from cities, far from offers to re-enlist. But Max stayed. Day after day, he never left her side, waking her from nightmares, sitting silently by her bed through sleepless nights, following her on every patrol through the lonely trails. He didn't ask for words. He didn't need answers. He just stayed. And through that silent, unwavering loyalty, Max brought her back to life, not with medication or therapy, but with the kind of understanding that comes only from a soul who's stood close enough to death to recognize its scent, just like she had. Now, watching Max lying silently by the ICU door, his eyes calm and steady like a temple sentinel, Rachel felt the circle complete. Max had once pulled her from the snow. Today, they had saved another life together. But somewhere deep in her gut, she knew this battle wasn't over. The evil that had abandoned that child was still moving, still watching from the dark. And just as that realization took hold, Max let out a low, almost inaudible whimper. His ears perked. Something had disturbed him. Rachel turned, hand tightening on his head, and gave a small nod. "I feel it too, Max," she whispered. "We have to be ready. This is just the beginning." Max closed his eyes for a moment, like an agreement, and turned once more to face the glowing door. And in that strange silence, down the dimly lit hallway of the hospital, the dog who had once braved a battlefield now stood ready again, not for orders, not for duty, but for something far more powerful: his heart. The next morning, as fragile sunlight filtered through the mist and melting snow tapped softly against the hospital awning, Rachel was still sitting beside Max in the quiet hallway, a cold cup of coffee untouched in her hand. Behind them, the ICU door remained shut, but the baby's heartbeat on the monitor had steadied since the night before. Each faint breath from that fragile life seemed to give Rachel just enough strength not to let go. But Max wasn't his usual calm self. From the moment a group of local police officers arrived to take a preliminary report about the discovery of the baby, something in him shifted. Ears pricked high, eyes sharp with warning, muscles tense, and a low growl rumbling in his throat when one of them stepped too close. Max wasn't the kind of dog who barked at shadows. He never reacted without cause. And Rachel knew that better than anyone. This wasn't just instinctive protection. It was a warning, a sign that something was off. Max sensed what the humans couldn't see. When one of the officers, a tall man with cold eyes and a gun slung unevenly at his side, leaned in to ask Rachel about the exact location where she had found the baby, Max stood abruptly, growling louder, the fur on his back bristling. His eyes locked onto the man like a storm-gathering force. Rachel placed a hand on Max's back to calm him, but her heart had already started to twist with unease. Minutes after the officers left, having gathered their so-called preliminary information, Rachel didn't hesitate. She called Tom Reynolds, the town's sheriff, and the only person in law enforcement she still trusted since leaving the military. When Tom arrived, still wearing his old brown leather jacket and carrying a file folder instead of a laptop, Max didn't react with tension. Instead, he walked up and gently bumped his head against Tom's knee. A quiet confirmation. This one's safe. Tom sat next to Rachel, eyes flicking through the glass toward the ICU, then said in a low voice, "I saw the report, but something's not right." Rachel nodded without hesitation. Max knew. The moment they walked in, she recounted every detail, how Max moved, the hard stares from those uniformed men, and the chill that crawled over her skin when one of them asked, too precisely, where she'd found the child. It wasn't curiosity. It was knowledge. Like he already knew where the baby had been. Tom's fingers tightened around the folder. His gaze darkened. "We're pulling every security feed around that forest. Anyone who entered or left in the 24 hours before you found the baby. I want to know." Max gave a low whine, then turned toward the door as if he'd been waiting for someone to give the command. Rachel stood, grabbed her coat, and followed, her eyes meeting Tom's with a weight that hung heavy in the air. "If those men weren't real cops," she said quietly, "and if that baby wasn't just abandoned, then we're dealing with something much bigger." Elsewhere, less than 15 miles from the hospital, in a windowless room, the cold-eyed man peeled off a fake police badge, laid it beside an unmarked gun, and turned to a phone playing security footage. On the screen, Max growling. Rachel holding him back. The man scowled, tapped to end the video, and muttered into the phone, "That dog it knows." A voice on the other end replied, flat and chilling, "Then deal with it." But the man only shook his head, eyes darkening. "Not that easy. That's no ordinary dog. That's the last thing you want to meet in a snowstorm." Back at the town sheriff's office, Tom scrubbed through old surveillance footage. His eyes narrowed when a black SUV appeared at 2:27 a.m., just 3 minutes before Max began digging in the snow. No plates, tinted windows. The headlights went off as it stopped at the edge of the woods. Tom made a note of the time and switched to a different camera angle. Outside the office, Max waited for Rachel, eyes fixed on the replaying screen as if memorizing every frame. Rachel looked at Max, then at Tom. "If Max has never been wrong," she said, her voice steady, "then what we're about to face isn't just abandonment. It's organized crime." She crouched down, laid a hand on Max's neck, and whispered, "You ready, old friend?" Max didn't bark. He simply stood and walked toward the door, leaving behind a trail of paw prints in the dust, marks of the path they were about to take. A path toward the truth in a darkness no light had ever touched. Right after Rachel, Max, and Tom left the sheriff's office, the three, 2 humans and a dog, drove to an old gas station off Highway 9, the closest point to the forest where the baby had been found. They were hoping the security cameras might have caught something. Inside, the stale scent of engine oil mixed with cold coffee hung in the air, blending with the creak of the aging ceiling fan to make the atmosphere even gloomier. But in that dim and dusty room lay fragments of a truth someone had worked hard to bury. The night shift attendant, a sleep-deprived young man with heavy eyes, pointed toward a dusty old computer in the corner and murmured, "Footage from that night hasn't been wiped yet. You can take a look if you want." Rachel sat down, Max lying silently at her feet, eyes wide and unblinking. The screen flickered to life, grainy but clear enough to thicken the air in the room with tension. At 2:29 a.m., a young woman appeared in the frame. Disheveled hair, thin coat, her face hollowed out by panic. She stumbled into view from across the road, glancing around wildly as though being hunted, then staggered toward the gas station. But just as she approached, a black SUV slowly rolled into the frame from the opposite side, headlights still off. The car door opened. A tall man stepped out, his face lost beneath a hood and shadows. His movements were calm, unnervingly so. He walked like a predator who already knew his prey had nowhere left to run. The moment he started moving toward the woman, Max leapt to his feet. No bark, just a low growl coiling in his throat. His ears pricked high, his gaze locked onto the screen with a fierceness like a blade. Rachel understood instantly. Max didn't react to just anyone. He only growled when something deep in his instincts screamed danger. And now, his entire body leaned toward the screen as if ready to lunge into it to protect the woman from the figure chasing her. Rachel stared hard at the frame where the woman suddenly turned and bolted, disappearing behind the shadows of the trees behind the station. The man stopped, paused for one long second, then turned back toward the SUV. Not running, not chasing, just calmly retreating, like a hunter who'd missed a shot but wasn't worried. Tom rewound and slowed the footage, freezing it at the moment the man turned. His face flashed in profile for half a second, barely lit, but enough to make Rachel's spine go cold. Max was still growling, low and steady, his eyes never leaving that frozen image, even as the screen went still. "No need for facial recognition software," Rachel said quietly, still staring at the screen. "If Max reacts like that, he's a real threat." Tom nodded, lips tight, snapping a still frame from the footage and uploading it to the facial ID system anyway. But deep down, he knew. Software could be wrong. Max wasn't. Rachel stood, placed a gentle hand on Max's head. It was meant to calm him, but really, it was gratitude. "Good work, old friend," she whispered. Max lowered his ears, stopped growling, but his eyes never left that image, as if he had memorized the man's face forever. Outside the gas station, the snow had stopped, but the cold still bit through the skin. Tom stepped out, pulled out his phone, and called headquarters. "I want a sweep of the entire 30-mile radius around town. A black SUV, no front plates, dark windows, seen at 2:30 a.m. A tall male suspect, possibly chasing Elena, the baby's biological mother." There was a pause. Then Tom's voice dropped, firm and final. "And notify the FBI. This is no longer just a local case." To him, those words were a turning point. An invisible line now crossed. Elsewhere, in a dimly lit, red-tinted room, the man from the footage stood before a wall of screens, one hand gliding slowly across a monitor showing images of Rachel and Max. His lips curled into a cold line. "It recognized me," he muttered, staring at the dog's eyes, burning through the video feed like they could pierce time. "We've got a problem." A dry voice behind him responded. "Give the order." He turned, eyes dark as a bottomless pit. "Not just a kill order," he said. "A full wipe, everyone, including the dog." And in that shadowed room, where men moved like ghosts and secrets twisted like smoke, a new plan was already in motion. One meant to erase anyone who dared to unearth the truth buried beneath the snow. Right after the gas station footage confirmed that Elena, the young mother, had tried to escape before the baby was left behind, Rachel knew they had to follow the next trace in that desperate journey. That woman might be the only key to unlocking the full truth buried beneath layers of snow and blood. Tom suggested that, based on the timestamp from the camera, if Elena fled the gas station at 2:30 a.m., the only nearby place she could have ducked into was a small 24-hour diner less than 2 miles away, a spot where long-haul truckers often stopped for midnight coffee and warmth during the brutal winter nights. They arrived just as the snowfall let up, the sky still bruised gray with the fading chill of the previous night. A flickering neon sign reading "Open" cast a dim glow on the weathered brick walls. Inside, the burnt scent of overcooked pancakes mingled with cold coffee, creating a strangely familiar melancholy. Max entered first, without needing a command. Every movement now felt deliberate, purposeful, like he was chasing faint traces of scent burned into memory. Footage etched in his mind that time couldn't erase. Within 3 minutes, Max stopped. He didn't bark, didn't move again. He simply stood still at a corner booth by the window, under the pale wash of a yellow light falling across a faint stain on the table. He dipped his head, gently touched the table's leg with his nose, then looked up at Rachel with serious eyes that said it all. She was here. Rachel froze, then walked over and quietly sat beside Max, scanning the room. The diner was nearly empty, just a few scattered customers and a middle-aged waitress with silver hair tied back high, her apron stained with oil. As she walked past, she paused, eyes widening when they landed on Max. She hesitated, then asked softly, a trace of confusion in her voice, "Has this dog been here before?" Rachel looked up and shook her head gently, but the woman had already furrowed her brow, fingers resting on her lips as if trying to recall something. "That's strange," she murmured. "He's standing right where that young girl sat last week. She looked exhausted, hair a mess, hands trembling, just kept staring out the window like someone was after her." She paused, her voice quieter now, as if speaking to herself. She didn't order anything, just sat there holding some kind of fabric bundle. "I think it was a baby." Max let out a soft whimper, eyes flickering like a spark had just ignited inside him. Rachel crouched down and placed a gentle hand on his head. "You remember her scent?" she whispered. Not a question, but a statement of fact. The waitress continued, her voice growing quieter, like guilt was creeping into her chest with every word. "I asked if she needed help, but she just shook her head. Before she left behind a little cloth. I think she forgot it. And it smelled like milk and snow." Rachel looked up, eyes suddenly alert. "Do you still have it?" The woman nodded, went behind the counter, and returned with a small piece of fabric neatly folded inside a plastic bag. As she handed it over, she spoke softly, almost like confessing a secret. "I don't know why I kept it. I just couldn't throw it away. There was something in her eyes that night that's been haunting me ever since." Max stepped closer, touched his nose to the plastic, then looked up at Rachel again. He didn't need to say anything. Rachel already knew. That piece of cloth carried Elena's scent, clear and unmistakable. At the same time, across town in a dimly lit room, the hooded man from the gas station footage was watching extracted footage on his phone. On the screen, he saw Elena stepping into that same diner, caught on a hidden surveillance camera the organization had secretly installed in known escape zones to track fleeing assets. His eyes were like ice, his hand clenching the cigarette until it crumbled. "She went there," he muttered through clenched teeth, "and that damn dog smelled her out." A raspy male voice from behind spoke up. "I can take care of it." The man turned, his stare hard as steel. "Not just the dog. The woman, too. We can't let them get to Elena. Not before the shipment to Moscow goes through." Back at the diner, Rachel stood and tucked the fabric into her coat pocket, her eyes following Max as he moved toward the back door, nose to the floor, tracking Elena's scent as it led outside. "She left this way," Rachel said to Tom, who was quickly falling in step behind her. "Maybe someone helped her. Or maybe she's still nearby." Tom nodded, hand gripping his radio tightly as he called out over the channel, "Send 2 more patrol units southwest. We've got a fresh lead." Max turned to look at Rachel, his gaze sharp, focused. Not just instinct anymore, but conviction. "We're getting closer." Rachel tightened her grip on the leash with one hand, the cloth pressed close to her chest with the other. She gave a single, silent nod. Inside her, something quiet but powerful took root. A growing belief that Elena was still out there, and as long as Max kept moving, they would find her before the man chasing her did. The path behind the diner gradually narrowed into a rough trail, lined with moss and frozen stones, winding between towering tree trunks that stood like the pillars of an ancient cathedral hidden deep within the forest. Elena's trail, though faint, still lingered in the low wind, in the fragile traces of scent only Max could detect. A sharper, more relentless instinct than any man-made tracker. Rachel followed closely behind Max, her eyes fixed on his upright ears as he led the way. Tom walked silently behind them, his gun holstered at his side, eyes sweeping the woods with the focus of someone who knew danger could hide behind any branch, any shadow. After more than half an hour of trekking through the dense forest, Max suddenly stopped at the edge of a gentle slope. He looked down toward a sunken patch of earth nestled beneath a canopy of old pines. There, half hidden by trees and time, stood a small wooden cabin. Its tin roof rusted, walls crooked and patched with wire and mismatched boards, windows boarded shut. Only the chimney bore dark smoke stains, a silent sign that someone had once lived, once cooked, once hoped here, and maybe feared, too. Rachel exhaled, her hand resting on Max's neck. She whispered, "You found it again." Max didn't respond, just gave a low growl and stepped forward, his nose brushing across the thin layer of snow at the cabin's doorstep, reading the footprints the wind had nearly erased. But they were there, and they told one clear truth. Elena had been here. The door creaked open as Max nudged it with his nose, the rusty hinge letting out a long, dry groan like the cabin itself was mourning its solitude. Inside, darkness swallowed everything except for a faint shaft of light cutting in from behind them. It revealed a simple mattress draped in a thin blanket, a wooden table marked with knife scratches, a cold wood stove, and a plastic baby bottle lying on its side beneath the table. Rachel bent down and picked it up. The inside was crusted with dried milk. The scent still clung faintly. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the wave of emotion rising in her chest. Elena had brought the baby here, had fed it, had tried to believe this place could be a refuge from whatever nightmare was chasing them. In the corner, Max growled quietly again, pawing at something behind the mattress. Rachel stepped closer and pulled free a piece of fabric. A small baby shirt with a cartoon bear printed on the front. A jagged tear ran down one side, as if it had been ripped in panic. Rachel's chest tightened. Every sign in this room whispered the same thing. Elena had hidden here with her child. But something had gone wrong. Something had forced her to leave the baby behind in the snow. Rachel turned to Tom, her voice low but firm. She didn't leave by choice. She was forced to. Tom gave a slight nod, his gaze shifting toward the rear window. That's when Max suddenly snapped his head around, ears perked high, a sharp growl in his throat. His eyes locked onto something outside. Movement in the woods. Rachel rose instantly, instinctively tightening her grip on Max's leash. Tom drew his gun, pressing his back to the cabin wall. A sound, barely audible but unmistakable, echoed from behind them. Not wind, footsteps, light, broken, cautious. Someone is trying not to be heard. Max crept toward the back door, body low, silent as a shadow. Rachel peered through the gap in the wood, and for the briefest second, she saw a figure slip past. Small, disheveled hair, wrapped in a worn brown coat, holding something tightly to her chest. She wasn't running, she was backing away, eyes wide with fear, with wariness. It was Elena. "Elena!" Rachel called out gently. No reply. Only the soft crunch of dead leaves. Then silence. Max bolted the moment he heard her name. No hesitation. "Max, wait!" Rachel shouted, but she knew it was useless. Once Max had locked onto someone he needed to protect, nothing could stop him. Tom rushed out through the rear, eyes scanning fast. Rachel followed, her boots sinking deep into the snow as she ran. "Elena!" she called again. "We're not here to hurt you. We're here to help." But the forest was thick. Snow had started falling again. The pale light of late afternoon blurred every shape, every shadow. Max stopped near a large tree, lifting his head and whining softly. Rachel caught up, her breath fogging the cold air, and saw them, footprints, small, hurried, pointed south. Elena had run, and she had taken with her the answers they were chasing. But Max didn't give up. He never did. He looked at Rachel again, eyes serious, determined, not asking, just waiting for her to nod. And she did. So Max stepped forward, slow and steady. His paws pressed through the snow, one after another, confident, silent, as if he knew that just ahead, beyond the thinning white veil, a mother was trembling at the edge of hope and despair. And he, quiet ears, tireless heart, was the only one who could bring her home. Just as Max picked up Elena's trail, weaving deeper into the southern forest, a faint but unmistakably unnatural sound broke the stillness. A delicate metallic clink from behind a large tree nearby. It wasn't the frantic footstep of someone fleeing. It was something more deliberate, more dangerous, like the soft brush of a bullet casing against a belt or the quiet nudge of a gun's safety mechanism being touched. In that exact moment, Max whipped around with a sharp growl, his entire body stiffening like a bow pulled taut. Rachel immediately understood. Elena wasn't alone in the woods. Someone else was here, hidden, waiting, watching, or ready to strike. Then, from the brush, a tall man sprang into motion. His face was half hidden beneath a thick wool scarf, his eyes cold and hard beneath the brim of a pulled-down hat. He surged through the snow like a shadow. Swift and silent, a black blur against the white. Max didn't wait for a command. He didn't need one. He launched forward with instinct born of something deeper than training. His powerful frame cut through the cold, his paws tearing at the frozen ground, leaving behind sharp streaks of disturbed snow. Rachel shouted after him, but her voice was lost to the wind. Tom, already reacting, pulled his gun and sprinted after them, yelling, "Police! Stop right there!" But the man didn't stop. He moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed his escape, slipping through trees, leaping over fallen branches and snowy ridges, every step a display of ruthless preparation. Yet Max was just as relentless. He stayed within striking distance, never letting the man out of his sight. With each leap, his body coiled tighter, his breath coming in fierce, steaming bursts, and his eyes locked onto the target like a living arrow fired with one purpose: justice. The chase tore through the forest for what felt like forever, though only 2 minutes had passed. Then, near a short, icy slope, the man's foot slipped. He stumbled, lost balance, and in that brief opening, just as he reached into his coat, Max launched into the air. He hit like a blade. With the full force of his speed and weight, Max slammed into the man, driving him to the ground. His teeth sank deep into the man's arm, forcing the gun loose. It flew out of reach, sliding across the ice into a frozen ditch. The man screamed, thrashing violently, but Max didn't let go. He held firm, pinning his enemy down with the unshakable force of a warrior forged through real battles, his eyes glowing like sacred fire. Unafraid, unstoppable. Moments later, Tom reached them, shouting, "Don't move!" as he shoved the man's shoulders into the snow and locked the handcuffs in place. Rachel arrived just behind them, breath ragged, eyes wide. Not just from the chaos, but from the stunning precision of Max's takedown. The man lay groaning in the snow, pain etched across his face. But there was no fear in his eyes. Only resignation, cold and quiet, as if he'd always known this moment would come. Tom searched the man's coat, pulling out not only a gun but also a small radio and a faded photograph. A woman's face stared back. Elena, marked with a red X. "Contract killer," Tom muttered, voice low and tight with rage. He was sent to finish this. Rachel's fists clenched at her sides, her eyes never leaving the assassin whose face was now buried in the snow. Max padded back to her, tongue hanging from exhaustion, fur covered in frost, but posture tall, still on duty, still guarding, still unshaken. "You did it," Rachel whispered as she knelt to wrap her arms around his neck. Not in triumph, but in heartbreak. Because if they had sent someone this deep into the woods, then Elena wasn't just running. She was being hunted. Far away, in a darkened room lit by the glow of surveillance screens, the leader of the organization stared at the red signal blinking on the console. The hitman's line had gone dead. He growled, slamming his hand against the desk, eyes dark and simmering with fury. "That dog," he hissed, turning toward his closest aide. "It's not just a dog, it's a threat." Back in the forest, snow continued to fall in a hush, blanketing the ground in silence. But Max had carved a new mark on his path, not just as a K9, but as a warrior, fighting for lives without voices, for souls who had no means to defend themselves. In Rachel's heart, she knew this wasn't just about finding a mother on the run anymore. This was a war against a hidden machine. And it had begun with Max's first counterattack, a living arrow in a forest of snow. The last wind of the day whispered through the forest, disturbed only moments earlier by a breathless chase. Snow began to fall again, as if trying to erase the traces of what had just happened. But it couldn't wipe away the silent victory Max had claimed. A victory not earned through gunfire, but through speed, instinct, and unwavering loyalty. As the captured hitman was escorted back to the mountain station, Rachel sat in the car, one hand resting on Max's back. He was breathing steadily, though his body remained alert. Inside the small police station, under the harsh fluorescent lights of a cold interrogation room, the man sat hunched in his chair, his cuffed hands trembling in front of him, eyes darting restlessly as if searching for an escape he already knew didn't exist. Tom leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his gaze unwavering, fixed on the man who had come dangerously close to ending the life of a woman desperately searching for a way out. Across from him sat Rachel, silent, her eyes sharp with disdain. Max had been allowed into the room and now lay beneath her feet, still and quiet. Yet his ears were perked, his eyes locked on the man like a breathing lie detector, ready to react to even the smallest betrayal in breath. "Start talking," Tom said, his voice calm but edged with steel. The man looked up and exhaled slowly, forcing a pale smile that failed to thaw the icy tension around him. "I don't know much," he began, his voice hoarse. Whether from exhaustion or guilt, it wasn't clear. "I was following orders. I was hired to retrieve a woman who stole property." That's how they put it. "I don't know her real name, just that she used to be an asset. Part of the network." Rachel's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Tom tilted his head slightly. "The network," he repeated. The man gave a subtle nod. "A shadow organization. Big. Very big. Human trafficking, segmented operations, transit points. They have their own rules and their language, and assets are just inventory. People treated like goods. Women, children, even newborns." He paused, eyes dropping to the table as if expecting sympathy. He got none. Rachel said nothing, but her silence cut sharper than any words. Max, sensing the evasion, lifted his head, his muscles tensing. When the man avoided mentioning the baby they had found in the snow, Max let out a low, deliberate growl. The sound wasn't loud, but it froze the room. The man flinched, eyes wide, sweat breaking across his forehead. "I wasn't supposed to talk about the baby," he stammered, glancing fearfully between Tom and Rachel. "I only know it was rare. A special gift," they said. "Meant for overseas, Moscow probably a transit hub." His voice cracked. Not from fear of the humans, but from the unrelenting gaze of the dog whose eyes seemed to peel back the layers of his deceit. Rachel tightened her grip on Max's leash, but she didn't try to calm him. She knew Max wasn't reacting to fear. He was reacting to a truth being buried alive. Tom opened a folder and slammed a photograph of Elena onto the table. "Who was assigned to oversee her?" he demanded. The man hesitated, tried to dodge. He mumbled about shelters, hot zones, logistics, but never touched the names that mattered. Max growled again, deeper this time, longer, with an edge that rattled the chair legs. The man's shoulders shook. He looked like he might pass out. Finally, as if something inside him snapped, he blurted, "Dario." It was Dario. He was her handler. I didn't want to say it. He's high level, one of Delgado's men. The room fell into stillness. Rachel and Tom exchanged a look that said everything. Delgado. The name had surfaced before in Interpol files, rumored to be the leader of the network, but no one had ever been able to prove he existed. Just whispers, scattered disappearances, and bodies never found. Now, because of Max, because of his unrelenting instinct, they had pulled a name from the shadows into the light. Max, having extracted the truth, lay back down. But his eyes never left the man in cuffs, as if to say, "Lies cannot survive long when truth is watching." Rachel placed a firm yet gentle hand on Max's back and whispered, "You caught something I almost missed." "Thank you." Max's ears twitched in acknowledgement. He didn't bask in praise. He didn't need it. He simply understood that the road ahead was far from over. Elena was still out there, running, and the reach of the network was wider than anything they'd imagined. But now they had a name, a thread, and Max, once again, was the one holding it. As the assassin's trembling confession concluded in the thick tension of the interrogation room, Rachel felt an unnamed unease creeping into her chest. Tom was on the phone requesting federal assistance, gathering more data on Dario and the network, while the investigative team debated the time needed for verification and coordination. Amid all the words, numbers, and procedures, Max remained by the window. The dog stood motionless, body taut as wire, sharp eyes fixed on an unseen point beyond, a place invisible to others but perceptible to him, trusted by instincts that had saved countless lives on the battlefield. Rachel approached Max, gently placed her hand on his back, and whispered almost inaudibly, "You sense something, don't you?" Max turned his head, his gaze meeting hers firmly. Not a reflex, but an unspoken affirmation. Without hesitation, without awaiting further orders, Max left the police headquarters with swift yet unhurried steps, as if following a unique signal, elusive to humans but clear in the mind of a being attuned to memory and scent. Rachel didn't hesitate, donned her coat, and called out briefly to Tom, "If he knows, I have to go." She then got into the car, fastened her seatbelt as Max leapt onto the seat beside her, eyes fixed ahead, like a silent navigator. Max led them in the opposite direction of the investigation map. Not to the location the assassin had disclosed, not to the cabin in the woods, but along an old road toward the northern suburbs, where a small, nearly forgotten hospital stood within the healthcare system. It was an unnamed spot on GPS, labeled merely as a local medical center, once a field aid station for construction workers over a decade ago, now operating with a few temporary wards, primarily serving undocumented individuals, the homeless, or those evading the formal system. Rachel glanced at Max as the car halted before the rusted iron gate. "Here?" she asked softly. Max's ears drooped slightly, and then he suddenly jumped out of the car, running straight down the narrow hallway leading to the rear building. Without needing directions or hesitation, Max seemed to know exactly where he was headed. Rachel followed closely, her heart pounding, a restless feeling as if an invisible thread was pulling her towards something very real, very fragile. A young nurse emerged from a patient room, paused upon seeing Rachel and Max, intending to intervene, but Rachel presented her security badge, her gaze brooking no interference. "I'm looking for a woman named Elena. She might be using an alias, admitted in the past few days." The nurse hesitated for a moment, then pointed toward the end of the hallway. "Room 12. She doesn't speak much, just clutches a bundle of cloth, refuses to let go." Max needed no further prompting. He dashed there, stopping before the silver door, placing his front paws on it and scratching gently, head lowered, body tense as if restraining a powerful but suppressed emotion. Rachel approached slowly, pushed the door open, and time seemed to stand still. In the soft yellow light of the hospital room, a frail woman sat curled on the bed, clutching a worn piece of cloth, her dark, disheveled hair framing eyes etched with sleepless nights and terror. As Rachel entered, Elena looked up, her eyes, though weary to the point of translucence, flickering with a faint light, not of hope, but of fear. "Don't make me go back, please." Rachel didn't respond with words. She knelt beside the bed, took the cold hand, eyes welling up. "Your child is alive, saved from the snow thanks to Max." Elena was stunned, her face contorting briefly in pain, then breaking as she buried her face in her hands. Sobbing, the cry of a mother who believed she had lost that tiny life forever. Max approached, gently rested his head on Elena's lap, silent and still, breathing softly, enough for her to feel another life, another heart quietly beside her. Elena bent down, pressing her forehead against Max's, whispering, "Thank you. Thank you for not forgetting me." Meanwhile, outside, darkness gradually enveloped the city. In that shabby room, a mother rediscovered her reason to live. A dog steadfastly fulfilled his role as a silent emissary of life, and Rachel understood more than ever. Their journey wasn't just about finding someone, it was about reconnecting the severed threads of trust, justice, and love once forgotten in the shadows. And it was Max, guided by inexplicable instincts, who brought them all back together. The atmosphere in the hospital room settled after the surge of emotions. For a fleeting moment, Rachel believed Elena was finally safe, that the fragile reunion between a mother and her child, abandoned amidst the snow, had the power to seal the doors of the past. However, Max remained ever vigilant. Though lying beside Elena's bed, his body relaxed as if resting. His eyes subtly tracked the hallway outside, ears twitching at each faint sound. His combat instincts never truly rested, and now a growing unease intensified with each breath. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, steady, slow, yet heavy, as if someone was deliberately controlling their presence. A figure appeared behind the frosted glass door, tall, clad in a crisp police uniform, badge prominently displayed on the left chest, and an ID card dangling from his neck. The man knocked lightly 3 times, then slightly opened the door, speaking in a calm, deep voice. "I'm the officer assigned to witness protection. There's an order to relocate Miss Elena to a more secure location." Rachel frowned slightly, instinctively stepping forward to inquire further, but Max sprang up before she could speak. His body taut, hackles raised, a low growl emanating from deep within his throat, signaling alarm. The man immediately stepped back half a pace, raising his hands as if to reassure, maintaining a composed tone. "I'm just following orders. Your dog seems tense. I don't want to cause alarm." But Max didn't retreat. Instead, he advanced a step, eyes locked onto the man, as if seeing through the uniform and the badge that appeared too new for his rank and demeanor. Rachel understood. Max had faced death, survived battlefields where deception and ambush were routine. If he reacted this way, the man before them wasn't a genuine officer. Rachel extended her arm to block, stepping between Elena and the man, her voice firm. "You mentioned an order? From whom? I need to verify with command." The man hesitated. A brief moment, but enough for Rachel to notice his gaze shift from her, darting quickly into the room, where Elena sat, face pale. In that instant, Elena understood. She had seen that look before. Void of humanity, only duty, and this time, she was the target. Max's growl deepened, resonating through the thick walls, drawing the attention of nearby nurses, while the man swiftly reached for his belt. A small motion, but unmistakable to someone experienced like Rachel. She grabbed her phone, activating the emergency line. "Central Station, confirm. Has any unit been dispatched to escort witness Elena Rodriguez from the suburban hospital?" A clear, sharp female voice responded. "Negative. No orders to move her." Upon hearing this, Rachel immediately looked up, but the door was ajar, and the man had vanished into the hallway, leaving only the swinging door and fading footsteps in the chaos. Rachel shouted, "Secure the exits! Imposter alert!" Then dashed out, Max close behind, his form like an arrow ready to pierce any obstacle. But by the time they reached the end of the hallway, Elena was gone. She had disappeared. Rachel's heart clenched. She scanned around, calling Elena's name loudly, while Max scoured the hallway, nose tracing every wall edge, every corner, eyes wild with desperation, not because he lost the trail, but because he knew someone had come too close, too fast, and had taken the woman he had just found with all his instincts. Elena, the mother who had survived with all her courage, was once again dragged into darkness. Rachel halted in the cold corridor, gripping the wall to keep from collapsing. She looked at Max, who stood frozen at the open doorway, whimpering softly. And she knew. This silence wasn't the end, but a call to a new hunt. They had come. They knew Elena was alive, and this time they wouldn't let her escape again. But Rachel also knew one thing, clearer than anything. Max wouldn't lose the trail again, not while she was alive. Not while the child still needed his mother. The real battle had begun. As the hospital doors closed behind the imposter in the police uniform, the atmosphere seemed to constrict, pressing against Rachel's chest as she and Max raced down the stairs, their urgency mirroring the escalating fear of losing Elena once more. In mere minutes, Elena had vanished, a painfully brief window for a vulnerable life to be seized again, yet ample time for the network's shadow to ensnare another defenseless soul. Rachel's eyes darted across the hospital grounds, anxiety mounting, while Max began sniffing along the sidewalk, his body taut with determination. Not far away, Elena lay curled in the back seat of an unmarked black SUV, her wrists bound tightly with plastic ties that bit into her skin. Yet, beneath her apparent helplessness, a quiet resolve burned, steady and unyielding. During her abduction, she'd secretly tucked a shard of broken patient ID card into her sleeve, pressing it against her restraints as a clandestine key to her freedom. She clung to the belief that if Max had found her once, she must survive to be found again. When the vehicle halted at the forest's edge, her captor yanked her out, neglecting to bind her feet. Seizing the moment, Elena feigned collapse, masking her efforts to sever the wrist restraints. Underestimating her, the man assumed her spirit was broken. But Elena was no longer the silent victim of before. Summoning her strength, she bolted into the woods, hands still partially bound, bare feet slicing against the icy ground, leaving a faint trail of blood. A breadcrumb path for any would-be rescuer. Across town, Max sensed it first. While Rachel and the police scoured the hospital and reviewed security footage, Max emitted a sharp alert, then sprinted toward a snow-covered fence bordering the property. Rachel pursued, shouting into her radio, "Max has a lead!" Heading south, the dog paused briefly at a patch of disturbed snow, inhaled deeply, then veered away from the residential area, guiding them toward an unmonitored forest. No cameras, no witnesses, only Max's instincts to rely on. Navigating the snowy terrain like a living arrow, Max tracked faint smudges and broken twigs. While others grappled with maps, he halted at a clearing, emitting a low, urgent growl. Rachel rushed forward, and from the depths of the forest, a weak cry emerged. Faint but unmistakably human. Pushing through the underbrush, they found Elena huddled beneath a barren tree, her wrists bleeding but her eyes wide with astonishment. Max approached, whimpering softly, pressing his warm body against hers. Through tears, Elena whispered, "I knew you'd come. You always find me." Rachel knelt beside her, embracing her tightly, emotions swirling, admiration, sorrow, profound gratitude. In the distance, sirens wailed, threading through the trees like lifelines. But amid the chaos, Max remained vigilant, eyes fixed on the forest where the abductor had vanished, carrying the name Dario and untold secrets. Rachel understood this wasn't over. Yet, Elena was alive. And thanks to Max, they had renewed purpose. A mother who fought for herself, a dog who never surrendered, and a story still unfolding amid ice, blood, and unwavering faith. Immediately after Elena was rescued and safely in Rachel's embrace amidst the white forest, Max continued to sniff around the area as if sensing something amiss. While medical personnel attended to Elena and the police set up barricades to apprehend the fleeing suspect, Max suddenly halted beside a narrow path leading deeper into the woods, his eyes taut like a wire stretched to its limit. Rachel noticed this change, that special intuition in Max, a sign not to be ignored, and without words, she immediately followed, signaling Tom to join her. The trio, a woman, a dog, and a man increasingly aware of the underworld they were confronting, disappeared into the silent pines, where only the wind's howl and footprints imprinted on the snow remained. Max led them to a small wooden cabin concealed by fallen trees and tangled vines. A place not marked on satellite maps, showing no external signs of life. But Max knew. He stopped about 10 meters from the door, ears perked, then emitted a soft whine. Not a warning, but a call for attention. Rachel crouched down, pressing her ear to listen closely inside. Faint, broken whimpers, like weak beings struggling to breathe, to live, to await someone to free them. Her heart pounded. She turned to Tom, signaling him to circle to the back door while she awaited Max's cue. Inside the dilapidated cabin, 2 children, a boy and a girl, were lightly bound to an old iron bed, limbs blue from cold, eyes wide open, too exhausted to cry. They were too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to know they were imprisoned. The guard, a burly, scar-faced man, sat cross-legged by a small fire, yawning, believing this place undiscoverable, unaware of the shadow silently approaching through the forest edge, something he was unprepared to confront. Max crept close to the window, let out a low growl, then dashed in the opposite direction, creating a loud noise amidst the stillness, triggering the guard's panic instinct. The man jumped up, grabbed his gun, flung open the front door, and charged out toward the direction Max had vanished. Simultaneously, Tom tapped lightly on the back window, signaling safety. Rachel swiftly picked the lock with a mini tool from her pocket and slipped inside. She hurried to the children, quickly untying them, wrapping them in her coat and whispering like a lullaby, "It's okay now. I'm here." The girl clutched Rachel's hand tightly, trembling but silent, while the boy buried his face in her chest as if hiding all his fears. Rachel took a deep breath, striving to stay calm. There was no time for emotion. Outside, Max had not yet returned. The man, after chasing Max about 100 meters into the forest, began to suspect. But upon turning back, it was too late. Tom appeared right behind him, gun raised, shouting, "Don't move!" The man attempted to flee, but Max, like a shadow looping back, leaped from the side, precisely targeting his left leg, toppling him onto the icy ground. He screamed, struggled, but Max merely pinned him down, not biting, maintaining the trained boundary, yet ensuring the enemy couldn't move an inch. Tom handcuffed him, eyes never leaving Max, shaking his head in admiration. "This dog is something we don't deserve." When Max turned his head, panting but eyes still vigilant, Rachel had carried the 2 children to the forest edge, her coat covering their heads, holding them tightly as if embracing Elena's unhealed wounds from before. Seeing Max, the children weren't afraid. On the contrary, they reached out to touch his warm fur, their eyes for the first time showing a faint glimmer. "You found the children again," Rachel whispered, gently stroking Max's head, her eyes unable to hide deep emotion. "You're not just a protector, but a beacon for those lost in the night." As the ambulance took the children away, Rachel sat beside Max, gazing at the now sealed cabin. In her mind, questions echoed. How many more children? How many more places like this, lying silently in forests, in cities, within the very world we live in daily yet forgotten? And she knew Max was thinking the same. The dog's eyes looking toward the deep forest were not random, but the instinct of one who had walked through battlefields. Wherever evil's traces remained, there he would go. And Rachel, for the first time in her life, knew she would never have to fight alone. After the 2 children were safely relocated and their captor apprehended, the atmosphere at the town's police station shifted, no longer charged with the urgency of chases, but with a tense silence, as if someone were attempting to extinguish the faint light illuminating the path to truth. Rachel returned to the station with Max, while Tom attended a meeting with federal agents, bringing along files and testimonies regarding Dario, Delgado, and other names emerging from the shadows of the network. Shortly after, Rachel settled at her desk to organize evidence from the cabin, hospital, and children's holding house. Max, resting quietly at her feet, suddenly lifted his head, body tensed, ears erect, eyes fixed on a figure entering the records room. It was Officer David Marlowe, a familiar face at the station, always affable, often bringing coffee for colleagues and assisting with paperwork. His gentle demeanor had never aroused suspicion, but Max thought otherwise. As David approached the table containing Elena's case files and those of the two children, Max sprang up, emitting a low but threatening growl, positioning himself between the stranger and the critical evidence. Rachel paused, glancing swiftly from Max to David, and though David's expression remained one of surprise with a forced smile, she noticed a subtle but telling detail. He didn't attempt to soothe Max as others typically would. Instead, he stepped back, eyes darting briefly towards the rear exit, like someone contemplating escape. Rachel remained silent. She gently patted Max's back, signaling him to hold his ground, then calmly gathered the files, feigning ignorance of any irregularity. Yet, within her mind, an alert had been triggered. Max's quiet vigilance was never meaningless. Throughout the afternoon, Rachel observed more closely, noting the times David frequented the records room, especially during Tom's absences or when senior officers were off duty. She planted a few decoy documents, a partial copy of Elena's movements and a summary of communications between federal units. Max lay in the corner, eyes half closed but ears attuned to the door, a silent sentinel. Around midnight, with only a few officers on duty and the hallway lights dimmed for energy conservation, Rachel sat alone in the surveillance room, monitoring the outdated security cameras. Then, as if on cue, David entered the records area with a casual yet hurried demeanor. He opened a drawer, extracted the decoy file, flipped through it rapidly, then used his phone to photograph the pages. His actions swift, practiced, and without hesitation. Rachel needed no further confirmation. She activated her communicator, whispering, "Tom, you need to return. We have a mole." But before Tom could respond, Max, stationed right outside the records room, let out a more intense, warning growl, startling David into dropping the documents. As he turned to flee, Rachel appeared, firearm raised, her voice chillingly calm. "I believe you'll be staying, Officer Marlowe." David slowly raised his hands, his facade of innocence shattered, the cold, empty look in his eyes confirming all of Rachel and Max's suspicions. He wasn't just part of the station. He was the eyes, ears, and hands of the network embedded within local law enforcement. He had been privy to every move, every plan, and if not for Max's timely intervention, the children might never have been found. Elena could have disappeared again, and Delgado's files would have remained buried in darkness. When Tom returned and searched David's locker, they discovered international SIM cards, foreign currency, maps marking transit points, and a printed list of coded assets sold overseas with symbols matching Elena's records. Rachel clenched the list, her throat tight. She turned to Max, kneeling beside him, whispering into his ear, "You perceived what we couldn't once again." Max didn't bark or growl. He simply sat, his deep eyes meeting Rachel's as if to say, "I will see even more. We're not finished yet." And Rachel knew that was true, because if a wolf could disguise itself within the police station, there were surely more lurking in the shadows. But she wasn't afraid, for she had Max, her loyal companion, the keeper of light in the darkness. After the arrest of the informant David Marlowe and the seizure of the assets list within the network system, Rachel and Tom realized that to dismantle the organization, they have to risk infiltrating its stronghold. Based on information extracted from David's phone and personal maps, a location was pinpointed. A warehouse on the outskirts of the city, formerly belonging to an international transport company but inactive for over a year, now serving as a covert transit point. A raid couldn't be authorized due to insufficient legal evidence, so Rachel volunteered for an undercover mission, posing as a special international buyer. In the records, international clients were always granted direct access to premium merchandise, and with luck, she might encounter Delgado himself. Max was, of course, indispensable. under the guise of a highly trained escort dog, typically accompanying high-profile clients to ensure personal safety in hazardous environments. Max entered the area without arousing suspicion. A small vest was draped over his back, concealing a communication wire camouflaged beneath his fur. Rachel donned dark glasses, her hair in a high bun, stepping out of an SUV borrowed from the bureau, her gaze cold and demeanor firm, embodying a businesswoman accustomed to negotiations devoid of compassion. It was all a facade, but her heart had never pounded so fiercely. Upon entering the warehouse, the dim industrial lighting casts a yellow hue on the oil-stained concrete floor, creating an oppressive atmosphere. Men in dark coats, without insignia, lined the hallway like shadows, scrutinizing Rachel's every step. Max stayed close to her left leg, appearing calm, but Rachel sensed the subtle tension in his neck. Every fiber of Max's being was scanning the environment, detecting familiar traces of past threats. Then, in a large room where merchandise was inspected and appraised, a man in a black turtleneck sweater emerged, carrying a distinctive blend of cigarette smoke and antiseptic. Max halted, not growling or leaping, but his ears suddenly perked, body taut like a coiled wire. Rachel glanced briefly at him, then fixed her gaze on the man. Tall, salt-and-pepper hair cropped short, a small scar at the corner of his mouth, giving him a perpetual sneer. He extended his hand, eyes sharp as knives. "Welcome. I'm Victor Delgado." Rachel's heart clenched, but her expression remained unchanged. "A pleasure," she responded, her voice icy. Max stood still, but Rachel felt a lump in her throat, for the scent on Delgado, the one Max was unmistakably recognizing, was the same that lingered on the jacket in the forest cabin where the child was left, where Elena had been held. At that moment, Max was like a living statue, motionless, yet every cell was recording, observing, analyzing. The man before Rachel wasn't just a leader. He was the alpha wolf, the mastermind behind the unfolding tragedies. Delgado led Rachel deeper into a locked room at the back, where he promised to show her the merchandise before she decided. But Max paid no heed to the conversation. He had begun identifying traces. The scent of recently confined children, human presence behind walls, faint moans seeping through ventilation ducts, and fresh footprints on the dusty floor. When Rachel subtly twisted the ring on her finger, a prearranged signal with Tom, Max moved a few steps away from her heel, slipping beneath a row of wooden crates. No one noticed, for to them, he was just a dog. But Rachel knew Max was doing what he did best, uncovering life within the shadows. Delgado smiled as he presented the sample, a frail child with bound hands sitting in a dark corner. But at that moment, Max let out a low growl, not at the child, but because, through a wall crevice behind, he detected another scent. The faint smell of blood, sedatives, and an infant's scent. Rachel tilted her head, her eyes glinting with resolve. "It seems this batch isn't as special as you advertised." Delgado raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly. "Perhaps you'll prefer the next lot. We always satisfy our international clients." Rachel remained silent, but in her gaze and Max's unwavering stare, the warning was clear. We didn't come to buy. We came to end this. And while Delgado believed he was orchestrating the game, down the hallway, Max had discovered an ajar steel door, behind which came a faint, weak cry, but real. This time, Max wouldn't just find them. He would bring the victims back at all costs. As Rachel exited the room where Delgado had showcased the first child as a sample product, her gaze colder than the ice lining the warehouse walls, Max, like an invisible compass, silently guided her through the rear corridor. The slightly ajar iron door, scratches on the concrete floor, and the faint, labored cries emanating from within acted as unspoken signals, beckoning with the intuition of one who has often traversed the boundary between life and loss. Rachel followed Max closely, each step bringing her nearer to the truth. But neither could have anticipated that beyond that cold door lay not only innocent children, but also a fragment of Rachel's past she believed was long buried. Inside was a makeshift medical care unit, cleaner than the storage rooms, illuminated by harsh white lights, with the scent of antiseptics permeating the air, attempting to fabricate a false sense of safety. On small beds lay 3 newborns, one still connected to an intravenous line. A woman in a white lab coat was checking the temperature of the boy on the left, her hands gentle, her expression focused. But as Rachel entered, she froze. Her graying brown hair slightly hunched back from years of diligent work, and a low, patient voice. "It's okay, dear. The doctor is here now." "Mom?" Rachel's voice broke, barely more than a breath, yet laden with emotion. The woman stiffened, turned around, and time seemed to stand still. She was Margaret Evans, Rachel's mother, a doctor who once ran a charitable clinic in another state, lost contact with her family after joining a humanitarian mission abroad, and then vanished. Now standing here, at the heart of an underground human trafficking ring, she was performing what she believed to be acts of mercy, unaware that her hands were unwittingly aiding in concealing atrocities. Rachel stepped forward slowly, her eyes heavy with emotion. "Mom, what are you doing here?" The question sliced through the veil of deception that Margaret had unknowingly been enveloped in. She stammered, blinking rapidly. "You Rachel?" "No, I'm just a doctor. They told me this was a place for abandoned children. I only provide care I didn't know." Max approached without a sound, without a growl. He neared the trembling woman and gently rested his head in her hand. A simple gesture, remarkably tender amidst the coldness of syringes and IV lines. Margaret looked at Max, their eyes meeting in silence, as if something beyond words was exchanged. She placed her calloused hand on the dog's head, now trembling not from the ailments of patience, but from the horror quietly unraveling within her. "They," she whispered, as if awakening from a dream. "They didn't tell the truth. They said this was an adoption center. I've never met the children's birth parents, only received medical records, cared for them until they were taken away. Oh God, Rachel, what have I done?" Rachel grasped her mother's hand, her voice softening amidst the whirlwind of emotions. "You didn't mean to. You're a good person. But we need your help to expose them, not just for the children here, but for mothers like Elena out there. And for yourself." Margaret nodded through her tears, her eyes now steady, because Max, in that simple, empathetic act, had shown her more than any explanation could. The dog didn't judge her, didn't see her as part of the evil, but as someone awakened from a nightmare, needing a hand to hold to stay upright. In the corridor, Delgado's voice approached. Rachel took her mother's wrist, whispering, "Come with me. Now." Max moved ahead, leading the way as if protecting not only the tiny lives in the room, but also a heart that had just found its way back after years of being lost. And for the first time since this battle began, Rachel realized not everyone within the system was evil. Some had simply never been seen through Max's eyes that didn't judge but wouldn't let deceit linger for long. As Rachel, her mother Dr. Margaret, and Max emerged from the makeshift care unit at the back of the warehouse, the initial sounds of an impending storm of justice echoed from afar. The wail of sirens, radio signals from the special forces, the roar of helicopters overhead, and searchlights piercing the darkest corners. Delgado, who had believed he controlled the entire situation, was unaware that the very dog he had underestimated, the one who had detected the scent of blood in the forest cabin and rescued the children from his grasp, was now leading the lightning-fast raid approaching him. Rachel pressed her hand to her earpiece, her voice firm yet calm. "Target confirmed. Team ready to breach." Tom, from the command vehicle at the perimeter, responded with steady assurance. "Await Max's signal. We're not entering through the main door." Only Max knew better than anyone. The side path looping around the back of the storage area, devoid of cameras and infrared alarms, but hiding a greater danger: the scent of explosives, tripwires, and chemicals camouflaged under the damp earth along the old corridor. As the elite units prepared to advance, Max had already left Rachel's side, sprinting towards the warehouse edge, a shadow moving silently through the snow. No noise, no alerting any sensors. Soldiers followed, equipped with mine detectors, but it was Max who halted at precise spots, sniffing every inch, growling softly upon detecting booby traps buried beneath the thin snow, mines capable of obliterating an armored vehicle if unnoticed. Thanks to Max, the team altered their route, closely following an old gas pipeline embedded in the warehouse wall, a sealed-off passage still wide enough for a small team to navigate. As they neared the eastern wall, Max paused by a side door, head raised, ears pressed against it. Inside were hurried footsteps, the clatter of weapons, and the frantic shouts of traffickers scrambling to gather evidence and flee through underground tunnels. Delgado, the boss who had once smirked at Rachel, now showed clear signs of panic. He barked orders, drawing the gun from his back, but before he could pull the trigger, Max had leaped over a wooden barrier, charging at him like a living storm. The impact sent Delgado sprawling, his gun clattering onto the concrete floor, and Max, as he had done countless times before, clamped down on his arm with unexpected strength for a creature unable to speak human language. Delgado screamed, struggling, but Tom tackled him from behind, handcuffing him in an instant. Rachel approached, breathing heavily, her eyes locked on the man who had treated human lives as mere commodities. "The game is over, Delgado. The children are no longer merchandise, and this time, no one will shield you." Amidst the chaotic shouts, the disarming of weapons, and the clinking of handcuffs, a symphony marking the end of a prolonged nightmare, Max sat quietly, eyes scanning every dark corner, ears still perked up as if asking, "Is there anyone left unfound? Any life yet to be freed?" Rescue teams entered, liberating dozens, women, children, even infants in incubators. Rachel led her mother, now ready to testify, out of the care unit, holding her hand tightly as if reclaiming a piece of truth just restored. On the way out of the warehouse, Max glanced back one last time into the shadows that had concealed so much suffering. No bark, no growl, just a gaze, a silent farewell to a past now exposed. Then he turned, quietly walking beside Rachel, not seeking rewards, not desiring titles, for the only thing Max wanted was to know that in this world of darkness there were still children who would live, be loved, and see the light of dawn. Amid the peak chaos of the raid, shouts, discarded weapons, and the echo of fleeing footsteps throughout the transit warehouse, a shadow quietly separated from the subdued human traffickers. Victor Delgado, the mastermind whom Rachel and Max had relentlessly pursued through a journey stained with blood and tears, seized the moment of conflict to slip through the rear emergency exit of the storage area. Navigating past toppled crates and through the backstage perimeter fence, his steps were light and deliberate, as if premeditated. As the tactical team's footsteps grew louder, Delgado broke into a sprint, his last bid to escape the tightening noose of justice. Yet, he overlooked one factor: a vigilant pair of eyes tracking him from afar, a four-legged figure slicing through corridors with razor-sharp instinct. Max. The dog had never lost sight of Delgado since he was dragged from the control room, driven not by command or predatory instinct, but by an unwavering sense of justice. As Delgado reached the yard's edge and began scaling the rusted chain-link fence enclosing the industrial zone, Max closed in, surging like a living arrow fueled by conviction, memories, and the countless children he'd seen languishing in dark rooms. Delgado grasped the fence's top, attempting to hoist himself over when searing pain tore through his shoulder, eliciting a sharp scream. Max had clamped onto his right wrist, locking on like a living steel trap, growling deep from within. Delgado thrashed, violently shaking his arm, blood splattering across the cold metal links, but Max held firm, unyielding. His eyes burned with a fierce amber glow, and in that instant, Delgado was no longer a formidable crime lord, but a mere fugitive ensnared by the embodiment of justice. Rachel arrived at the sound of the scream, breathless from the chase, firearm at the ready. Observing Max immobilizing Delgado, she lowered her weapon, swiftly approaching with handcuffs in hand. "Victor Delgado," she declared, her voice steady and resonant like a final bell toll. "You're under arrest for human trafficking, child exploitation, evidence tampering, and premeditated murder." Delgado managed a strained hiss. "You don't know who I am." Rachel cut him off, for she knew all too well who he was. The orchestrator of children torn from their mother's arms, the shadow behind cold glass observing lives commodified, the darkness looming over countless shattered homes. She secured the cuffs around his wrists, her gaze meeting Max's. The dog now retreating a few steps, muzzle stained with blood but devoid of satisfaction. For Max, capturing Delgado wasn't a victory, but the fulfillment of a silent vow. As Delgado was escorted away, blood dripping from his wounded arm, his eyes darted around in disbelief that he'd been bested by a mere dog. Yet that final, fear-laden glance at Max testified that justice doesn't require grand proclamations, only perseverance, loyalty, and an unwavering heart. Max turned toward Rachel, as he always had. She knelt, placing a hand on his head, whispering her gratitude. "Without you, he would have escaped." The night breeze rustled the chain-link fence, carrying away the scent of dried blood. On the cold concrete, Delgado was led away, not as a powerful kingpin, but as a criminal thwarted by the very being he had underestimated, a dog. And Max, as always, bowed his head, eyes gleaming in the darkness, silently moving forward, for there were still lives to save. When Delgado was led away in handcuffs, surrounded by the flashing red lights of police cars and the shouts of the tactical team clearing the scene, it seemed the nightmare had finally ended. But Max didn't stay by Rachel's side as he usually did. The dog stopped, sniffed the air, then turned his head toward the main warehouse, where flames had just erupted from a small explosion in the chemical storage area. Thick smoke curled up from the rusted metal roof, and in an instant, chaos returned, like a grim reminder that when evil is cornered, it often leaves behind its cruelest mark. Max didn't hesitate. He bolted toward the fire, slipping through columns of smoke that reached out like black arms from hell. Rachel shouted after him in panic, but Max vanished into the blaze. She tried to follow, only to be stopped by a firefighter. "It's burning inside, the place is too dangerous," he warned. But Rachel knew Max wasn't lost. He had never once turned back halfway. He must have heard something no one else could. And he had. At the far end of the crumbling hallway, where pieces of the wall had collapsed and the ground trembled with the screech of fire, Max found a small girl curled up behind a metal panel. Her long, tangled hair was streaked with soot, her bare feet dust-covered, and her eyes tightly shut. Not from fear, but because she couldn't open them. The girl was blind. Max paused, panting under the rising heat, but his eyes softened. He stepped closer and gently touched his nose to her trembling hand. The girl flinched, but didn't cry. Through the choking smoke, she whispered, "Is someone there?" Max let out a soft, soothing whine, then lay down, pressing his head into her palm like an invitation. Slowly, she reached for the tiny vest around his neck. As her fingers gripped the fabric, Max rose, carefully, steadily, and took his first step, guiding her to stand as if they had found a silent rhythm between two souls who had never met, but now trusted each other completely. Amid a world engulfed in fire, the sight of Max leading the blind girl out through a hallway glowing red with flames brought the entire rescue team to a stunned halt. No one dared break the silence of that moment, because it wasn't just a rescue. It was a miracle. The girl walked in perfect step with Max, her hand clutching his lead as if it were the only thread of hope in a burning night. She couldn't see the flames or the smoke, but she felt safe in every breath Max took, in the warmth radiating from his body. A different kind of flame, one that didn't burn, but soothed. When Max finally led her out the door, The team erupted in relief. Rachel was waiting, arms open. The girl threw herself into Rachel's embrace and whispered, "I thought I'd never get out." But he came for me. Rachel looked down at Max, tears filling her eyes but never falling. Max's gaze remained calm, his eyes closing briefly, not from exhaustion, but as if taking a breath before returning to his silent watch. By morning, that moment had been broadcast across every national news channel. The image of a vest-wearing dog leading a blind girl out of a burning warehouse, captured on a firefighter's body camera, played again and again. They called Max many names: the miracle dog, the spirit of courage, the silent warrior, but the one that stayed, etched into headlines and shared in emotional tributes, was Angel Dog. Not because Max saved a life, but because, in a moment of life or death, he didn't choose glory or recognition. He simply chose to do what was right, a symbol, the embodiment of justice without a uniform or a vow, a soul guided by the purest instinct to protect life, no matter the cost. From that day on, Max wasn't just Rachel's dog anymore. He became a symbol of hope for anyone who's ever been lost in the dark. As the final embers of the warehouse fire were extinguished, and the special response team quietly cleared the scene, bringing an end to a ruthless human trafficking ring, life was quietly beginning to grow again, in a place much warmer and gentler than the one it had left behind. Inside the pristine white walls of the neonatal care unit, Elena sat beside a tiny crib. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, spilling over the soft skin of her infant son, now pink, healthy, and breathing peacefully. The baby lay nestled in a soft blanket, eyes just barely open, gazing at the ceiling. One tiny hand curled gently as if searching for something familiar. Elena leaned down and pressed a kiss to his forehead, whispering in a voice no one could hear but her own heart, "Gabriel. Your name is Gabriel." When Rachel entered, holding a cup of hot tea, with Max trailing quietly behind her, Elena looked up, her eyes shining but steady. "I thought about it all night. I couldn't imagine any other name. Because if it weren't for Max, if he hadn't dug my baby out of the snow, if it weren't for his eyes, his footsteps, Gabriel wouldn't be here." She reached out and gently touched Max's head, her voice trembling with gratitude. "He's my son's angel." Rachel stood in silence, her hands tightening slightly around the cup. Her eyes softened with a quiet wave of emotion, not because of what she had done, but because for the first time, she truly saw Max as he was. Not just a retired soldier, not just a brave dog on the battlefield, but a bridge between people who thought they had lost everything, and a new future they never believed they'd reach. She sat down beside Elena, gazing at the sleeping child in the clear plastic crib, then looked up with a small smile, a lightness in her face after so many heavy days. "Gabriel will grow up in freedom, in love, and knowing he was born from courage." Elena nodded, then reached for Rachel's hand and held it firmly. "I can't do this alone. I want to create something for other women like me. A place to come back to, a home, an organization where they're not judged, not cast aside. A space to heal." Rachel looked into her eyes, and at that moment both women understood. Pain doesn't need to be forgotten. It can be transformed into something greater. A guiding light, an open embrace, a door that never closes on anyone. Max stepped forward and lay down beside the bed, resting his head on Rachel's leg, eyes half shut as if this safe space was already second nature to him. Rachel looked down at him and placed her hand gently on his head, stroking him with a quiet familiarity she hadn't realized had grown so deep. Her voice came soft, almost like she was talking to herself. "From today, you're no longer a temporary partner, no longer a line in a military file. You're family." Her throat tightened, then steadied. "I'm adopting you, Max. You won't have to go anywhere else." Max didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. He let out a soft, almost inaudible whine, as if to say he'd known all along. Just then, Gabriel stirred. His tiny hand slipped from under the blanket, reaching into space. Rachel offered her finger, and the baby grasped it firmly, as if trusting with instinct that this hand would never let go. Outside, the sun rose higher, shining down on trees just beginning to sprout new buds. The battle was over, but a new journey had begun, with a baby named after an angel, a mother who had refused to give up, a policewoman with a scarred heart who never stopped believing in justice, and a dog who could not speak but had never stayed silent in the face of what was wrong. From that day forward, Max was no longer just a service dog. He was Max, the living symbol of hope, and alongside Rachel and Elena, he would continue to lead lost souls home, into new arms, into a new beginning. After all the battles, after the tears, the blood, and the moments that almost gave way to despair, Max's story, the dog who never spoke, yet never stayed silent in the face of suffering, was told across headlines, on television screens, and in the hearts of those who had witnessed the miracle he brought. And then, on a crisp early winter day at the National Rescue Headquarters, in a solemn square usually reserved for honoring heroes in uniform or fire gear, Max walked onto the stage. Without a handler, without a leash, guided only by the steady stride of a being who had always let his heart lead the way. Rachel sat in the front row, Elena beside her, baby Gabriel nestled peacefully in his mother's arms, a mother whose embrace was now warm enough never to let go. Dr. Margaret stood nearby, shoulder to shoulder with Tom, in the seats of honor. Her gaze was quiet, but radiant, like someone who had finally stepped out of a moral fog to see herself clearly once more. When the host announced Max's name, the entire hall rose in unison. Applause thundered through the room, but Max, as always, remained calm. Not afraid, not excited, just those eyes, steady and deep, as if he'd seen all this coming the day he first stepped into the snow. In that space where so many had been honored with medals and speeches, Max needed no words. A rescue officer knelt down and gently placed a silver medal shaped like angel wings around his neck, whispering, "You are a warrior." Max didn't react with grandeur, just tapped his paw lightly on the wooden floor. A subtle gesture, but Rachel understood instantly. She smiled, eyes glistening. "Yes," she whispered, "we did it. Not just catching Delgado, not just rescuing Gabriel, but rebuilding trust, finding one another through the thick layers of pain and doubt, choosing what was right, even when every path forward was shadowed in darkness." The ceremony ended, but the story didn't. Max was led down from the podium, walking slowly across the red carpet now dusted with soft, falling snow. Baby Gabriel reached out from his mother's arms, as if trying to touch the warm fur he had once felt in the coldest moment of his life. Elena laughed softly, her eyes misty but bright, like the first sunlight of spring. Rachel bent beside Max, her hand brushing the medal now cold against his chest. She whispered a promise meant for no one else to hear. "From now on, we'll bring hope, wherever it's needed." And then, beneath the pale gold of late winter light filtering through tall trees, the dog with eyes like still water lifted his head once more, looking toward the horizon, where footprints still lay buried in snow, where children had yet to be named, where mothers were still searching, and where wounds remained open. Max needed no command. He was ready. The story closes on that faithful gaze, the one that had led Rachel, led Elena, and brought back those lost in the dark. But within that same gaze, a door opened again, not into cold silence, but onto new ground, where snow no longer meant forgetting, but a place where hope could be planted again. Max never spoke, but his actions said everything. That sometimes the quietest beings carry the loudest voice for justice, compassion, and unconditional love. From the moment he unearthed a fragile life in the snow to the day he guided a blind girl through fire, Max wasn't just a rescue dog. He was a living symbol of the hope we're all still searching for in this world. Do you believe a dog can change a life? Or even an entire community? If Max's story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share this video with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can keep bringing you more true, powerful stories of humanity. Thank you for being here with us. And remember, somewhere out there, a Max is waiting to write the next miracle.